How to sew the Sailboat blocks. These are part of the Sampler Quilt by Amber Makes, and they're available in 2 different colourways, China Blues and Country Garden. Follow me and I'll show you how to make 3 different variations of the beautiful Sailboat Quilt block. Cutting out. Take the panel from your kit and give it a good press. This is the Country Garden panel. If you've got the China Blues panel, the fabrics will be the same, just in different colours. Now, if you look at it, you can see all the fabric pieces have got a number above them. So fabric 1, fabric 2, fabric 3, and so on. You need to cut round all the fabric pieces, leaving a little bit of white fabric, but with the number above, as you can see here. So you can see here, fabric 1, I've got the name above it, so it says fabric 1. You'll need this when you're cutting out, so you remember which is which. So you will be cutting these pieces of fabric into smaller pieces, but keep the number above. So you can see these are all in there, and if you've got the China Blues fabrics, they'll be the same prints, but just in a different colours. Now follow the instructions that are in the measurements that are in the printed instructions in your kit to cut all the pieces out like this. So here's all the pieces I've done, and I've labelled them. Now you can either photocopy the page in the instructions and label them, or just write them by hand on a scrap of paper. Once you've cut and labelled all the pieces of fabric, arrange them into 3 piles. You'll need 1 pile for the triangle sails block, 1 for the pinwheel sails block, and 1 for the stripe sails block. You're going to be making 1 block at a time, so it's a lot easier if you sort them all out now. And that's why it's important to have labelled everything. So when I cut mine, the instructions explain how you cut across the width of the fabric and then cut those widths into smaller pieces. And then I put all of the pieces together and then I've arranged them. It's also really good to get all the cutting out of the way before you begin, and then you can just concentrate on the sewing. So you can see some of these blocks have little pieces and some have longer pieces. Just depends on where they're going. Then cut the background fabric out, and again, label that. I've put these into piles, so that's all the triangle sails and the pinwheel sails and the stripe sails. So I've put those all into piles, and then put those piles, keep them separate so that you can then work on 1 block at a time. How to snowball a corner. This is a technique that's used throughout these blocks. I'm going to show you how to do the technique here. It's when you cut off a corner using a small piece of fabric from a larger one. So take the piece of fabric that you're going to be using to cut off the corner and draw a diagonal line on the wrong side of it. I'm using a plain fabric here for this corner, so there isn't really a right and wrong side, but if you're using a print fabric, put it on the wrong side. Now place that corner on that fabric on the larger piece in the position shown in the instructions. So for this one, we're going to snowball the bottom left corner. So therefore, the diagonal line goes from top left to bottom right. So you can see we're going to be cutting off that bottom left corner. Now sew along the line that you've drawn, like this, and then before you trim it, take the corner and fold it over to the opposite corner and press it, and this just pulls it into shape to make sure you've got a nice neat right angle. Then, making sure you don't cut off the top piece but you just cut off through the bottom, trim the seam allowance. This then snowballs the corner, which basically means you're cutting the corner off, creating a triangle without having to use any triangular seams or triangular pieces. It's an easier and quicker and neater way to snowball a corner. Let's start by making the triangle sails block. First of all, we're going to make the half square triangles called the HSTs. So take all the fabrics that you cut for the triangle sails block and lay them all out so you can see which piece is which. Now we're going to start off by making the half square triangles, so you'll need the fabric pieces for that. So to make the first set, you're going to need the fabric B, half square, triangle, square, and the background fabric, and place these right sides facing. So I'm going to show you now how to make 8 half square triangles in one go. So on the wrong side of one piece, I'm going to use the background fabric for this one. Draw a diagonal line from one corner to the opposite corner using a pencil or an erasable pen. You'll be cutting along these lines, so it doesn't really matter what pencil you use as long as it's not something that will bleed into the fabric. Now place this right sides facing with the other fabric piece, so this is the fabric A. and pin them together. So the fabrics are right side facing. Make sure all the raw edges are matching up and the drawn diagonal lines are on top. Pin them together away from the lines, and then you can keep these pins in place as you're sewing. Now you need to sew 1/4 inch either side of both lines. So you'll have 4 lines in total. So you use your machine foot to judge that, or you can draw those sewing lines in if you prefer. So now I've sewn all 4 lines. I use my machine foot to judge the 1/4 inch, but do draw them in if you prefer. Now, put your fabric on your cutting mat and cut along one of the drawn lines, so that's between the sew lines. Now, keeping the fabric still, rotate your cutting mat, or if you don't have a rotating one, just turn your cutting mat round and cut along the other drawn line. Now, making sure all the pieces stay steady and in one place, cut vertically through. If the triangles move, like mine have, just put them back into place and cut vertically through the centre. Match up the horizontal line on your ruler to make sure that this line is straight. Turn it around again and cut vertically through the centre. So you've now divided your 2 squares into 8 triangles. So there's all 8 of the triangles, and these are your half square triangles. Now you need to press these open. So take your pressing mat and take your half square triangles. Now take one of them and open it up and press it towards the darker fabric. So for this one, I'm pressing it towards the print fabric. So you're pressing the seam over to one side. But if you do it like this and open it up and press them, then they will all then look like this. So your half square triangles are now sewn, but they need trimming because they're made bigger than they need to be so that you can cut them accurately. These need to be cut into a 2.5 inch square. So line up the diagonal line on your ruler and then make sure that it's central, so you've got 2.5 inches. It's central between that. And cut along the right hand side and along the top. Turn it round 180 degrees and then line up the 2.5 inch mark on your ruler, making sure that diagonal line goes to the centre, and again, cut along the right and along the top. And that trims your half square triangle into a perfect 2.5 inch square. Repeat that with all of them, and then that's all your set 1 HSTs made. You will have made 8 of them because that's the most fabric efficient way to do it, but you only need 7, so you can discard one or keep one for future projects. Now we're going to make set 2. These are made from fabric B HST square and 1 background fabric HST square. So make the 8 HSTs in exactly the same way as you've just done and trim them all. Now for set 2, you will have 8, but you will only need 6 of these. So clip them together, and that's your 2 sets of HSTs finished. Assembling the sail section. Now you need to take your 2 sets of half square triangles and the background fabric squares. You'll just need 3 of the background fabric squares to put the others to one side for now. Now, referring to the diagram that's printed in the instructions, lay all of these half square triangles and the background fabric squares in the order that's shown, because this is going to create the sail section. So just lay them out. You can follow the video here, but there is a coloured printed diagram in your instructions booklet, which is easier to follow, so you can just make sure that you've got them all in the right order, so that the sails of the same print run diagonally through this block. So if you check just as you're doing it, that you can see that those prints are running diagonally through to create the triangle sail effect. This sailboat block is one of the most traditional and simplest one as it's just made from these triangles, but it gives a really pleasing effect. Double check everything's in the right order. You will have 4 squares or HSTs in each row, and there are 4 rows. Now join the HSTs and the squares together in each row by placing them right sides facing. Take them off one at a time and pin them together, and then you won't get them mixed up. So you can see I'm taking them just from the top row. Make sure the raw edges on the sides and the top and the bottom are matching and pinned together. I like to pin together 1 row at a time like this, and then I can just go to the sewing machine and sew all of these seams. So now you can sew all of those together and then pin and sew each of the rows individually. And then it will look like this. Now, to help to get these to join together neatly, press all the seams in different directions. So for the top row, I've pressed them to the right, the second row to the left, the third row to the right, and the fourth row to the left. So that they're pressed in opposite directions. You can then nest the seams and the squares and the HSTs will match up better. So place the first row and the second row right sides facing, and then nest the seams by, if you take the top seam and just pull it over, slide it gently, it will stop because of the different heights in seam allowances because you press them in opposite directions, and then the seam will match up exactly. So if you work your way all the way along, slide the top seam over the bottom seam, and when it just stops or nests, then you can pin it together. And repeat that all the way along the row. And then you're more likely to get them all the seams. If the seams don't match up exactly, it really doesn't matter because they will be near enough because you've nested the seams. And then pin it together at the other end, just so the raw edges are matching. And sew row 1 to row 2. Then, so in the same way, sew row 3 to row 4. And then once you've done that, I press these seams open to just keep them nice and flat. So the row 2 to row 3. I prefer to do it in pairs like this. You've got less fabric and it's just easier to keep it neat. Once you've done that, I pressed all these 3 seams open. You just need to add the side borders. So there are 2 side borders. And place these right sides up either side. You can see that they're the same size, and then sew one to the right and one to the left. Sew them so that you've got the side border underneath and the pieced sail block sails on top. This is just so that when you sew over all of those seam allowances you've pressed open, you can make sure that they stay pressed open because you can see them. They won't get twisted and you'll just get a neater finish. So once you've pinned that one, pin the other side border into place and sew these. And then this is your sails section finished, and I've pressed those seams over to one side. Assembling the block. So we're going to start by making the boat section. So we need to snowball the bottom left and the bottom right hand corners of this. Now remember, the video tutorial at the very beginning of this video shows you more detail about snowballing a corner, but I'm going to show you here where to put the lines. So draw diagonal lines on the background fabric squares because you've got 2 left over. And place these on the left hand side and the right hand side of the boat piece. So on the left-hand side, the diagonal line needs to go from top left to bottom right because we're going to be snowballing the bottom left corner. So pin that into place. And then with the other background fabric square, put that on the right-hand side, matching raw edges. And the diagonal line needs to go from top right to bottom left because we're going to be snowballing the bottom right corner. So sew along these lines. And then trim the seam allowance and snowball the corner as explained in the tutorial at the beginning. And that's the boat piece finished. Now you need to sew the boat to the bottom of the sails. So place these right sides facing. Turn it over though because you need to be sewing with the sail piece uppermost as it has the most seams, and it will keep those seams that you've pressed over to one side in the same direction for a much neater finish. So always sew with the piece on top that has the most seams. So pin it together at either end to make sure it fits nicely, and then you can pin it along between the two. When I've got lots of seams sewn to another piece like this, I like to put it on my ironing board, push a pin in that holds one side in, and then you can pull it slightly, and that will open up the seams of the top piece because there's so many seams there that it pulls the fabric in. But if you anchor it with a pin through your board on the right, then you can just then place pins. I always do it like this, where I push pins in vertically through all the seams, and now that's neat and anchored in place, and also it fits evenly across the boat piece. You can then just take those pins and push them in through the seams and then sew this together. Once that's done, you've now attached the boat piece, and I've pressed this seam open to keep it flat. Now you need to attach the C. So take the C piece and place that right sides facing along the bottom of the boat and pin it into place at either end. Because you haven't got as many seams, you've got just those two snowballing seams, it will fit easy. We won't have to pull it to fit because you haven't got the same seams to open. But because the two pieces are the same size, they will fit together nicely. So sew these together, and that is your triangle sail blocks finished. I've pressed that seam open, it's nice and flat, and that's block one, all done, ready for the next one. We're now going to make the pinwheel sails block, and we'll start by making the pinwheel. So take all the fabric pieces that you've cut, the print and the background fabric for the pinwheel sails block, and lay them all out so you can see which piece is which, because you've labelled them all so you can see what you're going to use for what section. So I've put them in piles for each different section of this. And well, we're going to start off by making the pinwheel that's on one of the sails. So for this you need the pinwheel HSTA and HSTB square. Take those two squares and place them right sides facing, making sure the raw edges match up. This is to make the little pinwheel that decorates one of the sails. So we're going to make some half square triangles to create the pinwheel. We're going to make 4 at a time because it's an economical way of using the fabric and much quicker as well. So pin them together and then sew together all the way around the edge. Don't leave a gap, just sew 1/4 inch seam allowance and sew all the way around the edge, just like this, so you've sewn them all together. Now place your sewn squares on your cutting mat and cut from one corner to the other diagonally. Turn it around, make sure those squares haven't moved by pushing them back together, and then cut across the other corner diagonally. And this divides your sewn squares into 4 triangles, which are going to be your half square triangles. So open up all of these and press them towards the darker fabric. So I'm just finger pressing them for now, but use your iron to press them. And then they will look like this. So you've pressed them open, but they now need trimming, so that they're exactly the right size. They're made oversized so you can trim them perfectly. They need to be trimmed so they're 1.5 inches square. So take one of them, place the diagonal line on your ruler along the diagonal line and make sure that you're going to cut it to 1.5 inches so that it's laying centrally between that 1.5 inch square mark. Cut along the right hand side along the top, turn it round 180 degrees and then match up the 1.5 inch square on your ruler, that bottom corner. You can see I've kept the line straight and the diagonal line, and cut along the right hand side and the top. And that trims your pinwheel square to exactly 1.5 inches. And then you'll get a neater finish for the whole pinwheel because you're working with exact size squares. Now look at the diagram that's printed in the instructions and lay out the HSTs in the order shown. I mean, obviously you can follow the video here to see that, but I'm going to lay them out into the order shown to create the pinwheel effect. So you can see how the prints alternate. Now sew the 2 HSTs in the top row together by just pinning them, and then take the 2 HSTs in the bottom row and pin them together. If you get them twisted as you do it, just lay them back down again to make sure, because they're quite little, but you've only got to make 1 pinwheel. So I know this is little squares, but it's worth it because it makes a really nice detail on your finished sailboat. Now press the seam on the top row to one side and the bottom row to the opposite direction. And then place these 2 rows together. Move the top one so that the seams nest. So just slide the top row over onto the bottom row just so that the seams nest in the centre for a nice neat finish, and then pin together either side, keeping those raw edges matching up, and sew together to join the 2 rows together, and then give it a press. I've pressed that seam open to keep it nice and flat, and that's your pinwheel finished, ready for the sail. Making the left sail section. So start by sewing the left-hand side of the pinwheel to the right-hand side of the lower left sail piece. It's easy to see which is which because you've labelled them all. So pin these, making sure obviously the fabric with the most seams, which is the pinwheel, is on top. Sew this together and then press the seam over to one side. Now you need to snowball the top left corner of the lower left sail using this background fabric lower left sail corner. So draw a diagonal line along the wrong side of the fabric from one corner to the other. Place this on the left hand side so that the diagonal line goes from top right to bottom left, because we're going to be snowballing the top left corner, and then sew along that drawn line. Then trim the seam allowance and press, as explained in snowballing the corner at the beginning of this tutorial. Now you need to take the upper left sail and the upper left sail corner, because we're going to snowball this. It's the easiest way to do this rather than cutting two triangles, is to snowball this to make the nice upper sail. So draw your diagonal line on the background fabric, which is the upper left sail corner square, and place this right sides facing with the upper left sail square. Pin the two pieces together and sew along the diagonal line, and then snowball the corner. Now we just need to sew to finish the upper sail. Sew the left hand side of the upper left sail rectangle to these two pieces together. So you sew the left hand side of one to the right hand side of the other, and sew them together, and then this completes the upper left sail. So that's just joining the rectangle on. Now we need to sew the upper left sail above the lower left sail, which is the piece that you just made with the pinwheel on it. Make sure that this seam is important, where the two triangles are. Make sure that seam matches up by pushing a pin vertically through the top seam so that it comes out exactly at the bottom, because this is where the sail is going to slope along. So if you can just match up that one seam, then you'll get a neater finish. So I'm pinning it together at either end. And then where that vertical pin is holding those two seams together exactly, just pin diagonally across. You can then remove that vertical pin and then just pull that slightly, because that's the seam that's got all the pinwheels in it, so that it fits nicely. And then sew the upper left sail to the lower left sail. And then it will look like that. And because you matched that seam up, you've got that nice diagonal line. Now we need to just finish this left sail section off with the borders. So sew the top border to the top of the upper sail. Again, pin from the side that has the most seams, and make sure you always match up the raw edges at either end and then in the centre to get a perfect fit. And then sew the left sail bottom border to the bottom of the lower sail section. So you're stitching it together across the pinwheel. If you want to double check as you're doing this, there are full block diagrams of all of these in your instructions. So what I like to do is when I pin everything together, I just double check and have a look at the block diagram. They're all coloured in and they're all drawn to scale, so you can easily see which piece goes where. Sew these borders into place like this, and I've just pressed the seams over to one side, and then take the left sail side border and sew this down the side of the left sail like this. Again, pin from the side with the seams, because you've got some seams here that are pressed open, some over to one side. And you can do either. It's up to you whether you want to go over to one side or press them open. But do try and keep them pressed that way while you're sewing, just so then you don't get twisted seams. Sew this together, press the seam over, and you've now completed the left sail section. Making the right sail section. So take the right sail pieces, and on the wrong side of the background fabric right sail piece, draw a diagonal line from one corner to the opposite corner, because we're going to snowball a corner to create the right sail. So draw the line and then place this right sides facing with the right sail fabric piece. and pin together. Now with this fabric piece, I've placed it so that the lines are running vertically because this is a fabric that has a stripe on it, but it's up to you which way you want your sail to run, but I wanted mine to run vertically. So sew along the drawn line and then press it open, or I pressed it over to one side, and then take the right sail top border and place that along the top edge. So make sure that you follow the order here, or follow the block diagram, so that you've got the triangular sail on the left and the background fabric sail part on the right, so it looks just like this. So when you sew it, so make sure that the sail is the right way up. So put the top border on the top and the bottom border along the bottom. So pin that into place. And you can see that the sail is now the stripes are running vertically. If you want yours to run the other way, when you snowball the square in the previous step, just turn it around. So sew this top border and then sew the bottom border into place. Press the seams over to one side, and this completes the right sail section. Assembling the block. So now going to attach the mast. So take the mast, please, and place it between the left sail section and the right sail section, because we're going to sew them together. So sew the left-hand side of the mast to the right-hand side of the left sail section. Place them right sides facing, and again, place the sail on top as it has all the seams, and the mast is just a plain piece of fabric. Pin together at either end, and then pin together between. Now this is quite a small piece, so you can just pull it and then pin so it fits. Or you can use the method that I like to use, where you put it on your ironing board and anchor it by pushing a pin in. But with this one, it's not too long, but you will need to pull it slightly because of all the seams, just to open them up. When you've sewn the left sail section, sew the other side, so the right-hand side of the mast, to the left-hand side of the right sail section. So you're sewing the mast between to join them together, and then it will look like this, and there's the mast now in place. I've pressed these seams open because there's a lot of bulk here, and it gives you a flatter finish. Next, we need to make the boat. So the boat is made in the same way as you did with the triangle sails block. You need to snowball the bottom left corner and the bottom right corner. So if you take the two boat corner squares, draw a diagonal line from one corner to the other, so it's diagonally across exactly through the centre, and then place these squares on the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the boat section. Make sure on the left that the diagonal line is running from top left to bottom right like this, because we're going to be cutting off the bottom left section to create the shape of the boat. And then with the other boat corner square, put that on the right hand side. Make sure the raw edges all match up so it fits exactly on the right hand side. The corner needs to go from the top right to the bottom left. And then sew along these lines. And press and trim the seam allowances to snowball the corners, and there's the boat finished. You can now sew the boat below the sails, and the mast will go then into the boat. So place it with the sail section right sides up, pin together at one end, and then pin together at the other end. And then the sides will match up exactly. I'm going to anchor this on my mat. So just push the pin, once you've pinned together at each end to make sure that they match, push the pin into your ironing board or mat to anchor it, and then pull the left-hand side gently. So you're not actually stretching the fabric when you do this, you're just pulling it so that it opens the seams, because where you sew pieces of fabric in, it pulls the fabric in just very slightly. So by pulling it gently, it just opens up the seams so that it will fit the piece that you're sewing. Everything is cut and pieced so it will fit, but it's just the seams that pull them in. And by doing this, it means that one fabric strip will fit more evenly across a pieced fabric strip. Then sew together. So there's the boat attached. I press this seam open to keep it nice and flat, and you just need to sew the C on. So take the C piece and place it right sides facing along the bottom of the boat piece. And again, you can just pin this together as there's not so many seams here. But I tend to get into the habit of pinning. I usually pin standing at my ironing board anyway, and it's a nice surface that you can pin into. And it's a great height as well. My ironing board is my great workstation, because it's a good height and you can pin into it and you can press onto it. And you'll just get a more accurate finish if you do this. Then once you've pushed those pins in, you see you can lift them out without pulling them right out of the fabric, but just angle them back in to pin them together, and everything is really secure. And then sew the C to the boat. And then press that seam open, and that's the pinwheel sails boat finish. Now we're going to make the striped sails block. Let's start by making the left sail section. So take all the fabric pieces you've cut for the striped sails block, and I've arranged these into piles of the sails, of the two different sails, and also the boat and the mast. So we're going to start by making the left sail section. So take all the pieces for that. Now, first of all, we're going to make the sail, and this is made up from strips of fabric that are joined together in a row, and the strips are vertical like this. So place them in the order shown here, or there is an arrangement diagram in the instructions to show you. So sew them together, right sides facing, and take the labels off as you sew them to make sure that you've got them all in the right order. Sew them all together, and then they will look like this. And I've pressed these seams open to just keep them nice and stable. Now we're going to turn that into a triangle so it looks like a sail. So if you take the background fabric left sail square, draw a diagonal line from one corner to the opposite corner on it. This is on the wrong side, but obviously it's a plain fabric, so you won't be able to tell the difference. Then place this right sides facing with your joined pieces. Make sure that the joined sail pieces stay facing so that they're vertical, as shown in the diagram and like I'm doing here, so that that diagonal line runs from the top right to the bottom left corner, but making sure that those pieces are vertical. If you do it the other way round, it's just that your stripes will face horizontal instead. And if you want them to look like this and in this arrangement, then just double check that you've got that diagonal line running the right way. So pin it together at either end, and because that piece below is seamed, you'll need to pull it a little bit gently to make it sure that this background fabric square sits evenly. Once that's done, sew along the line and then snowball the corner as you've done before. You can see I've pressed the seam over to one side. Now to finish the left sail section, you need to sew the top border to the top, and that's labelled, as you can see, left sail top border. Sew that along the top edge of the sail. Again, double check against the diagrams in this video to make sure that you're sewing it along the top and you've got the stripes of the sail running vertically, and then pin and sew the left sail bottom border along the bottom. You can always double check against either the individual diagrams in the instructions which show each of these stages, or look at the whole block diagrams. When these whole block diagrams on the instructions are shown in both colourways, if you want to just double check you've got everything in the right place. And then sew these into place, and it will look like this. And I've pressed these seams over to one side, and then take the side border. There are two side border pieces, so just take one of them, because the other one is used for the other sail, and sew this to the left-hand side of the sail. And then it will look like this. And then your left sail section is finished, ready to move on to the right sail section. Making the right sail section. So take all the pieces that you've cut for the right sail, and then we're going to start off by making the sail itself. So this is made from 3 fabric strips, but this time they're joined together so that they're horizontal, so it's different to the left sail. So lay them out in the order shown here, there's a diagram in the instructions that shows this order, and sew one below the other, right sides facing, and then you can remove the labels as you go. And then that's the right sail all pieced together. I've pressed those seams open. Now we need to turn it into a sail, so take the background fabric right sail piece, and on the wrong side draw a diagonal line from one corner to the opposite corner. Now place this right sides facing onto your joined sail pieces. Make sure the sail pieces stay horizontal, and that line needs to go from the top left to the bottom right. So pin it into place. Now obviously you need to pin with the drawn line uppermost so you can see it, but obviously you've got the seams of the piece underneath. So as you're sewing, just sew slowly and just double check that you're not twisting those seams as you sew over them. And then sew down that line and snowball the corner as you've done previously, and that completes the right sail piece. Now take the right sail centre and sew that above the right sail. So check it on the diagram and the video here to make sure that you've got the sail facing in the right direction. So it's a triangle with its bottom corner of the triangle in the left-hand corner. And sew that centrepiece above. And I've pressed the seam to one side for this. Now we need to make the flag before we can sew it on. So take the flag section and the flag piece. You've got the background fabric piece and a print square. And to make the flag, we're going to snowball the corner. So draw a diagonal line across your flag square from the top left to the bottom right. And then place this right sides facing on the left side of the background fabric flag section. Make sure that the top, bottom and left-hand sides raw edges meet up, and that diagonal line faces from top left to bottom right. And then just sew along that line. And then press and trim the seam allowances to snowball the corner, and that's the flag section finished. Place this right sides facing along the top of the right sail centre. You can see it's exactly the same size because you've cut everything out in advance, do all the measurements. It all fits nice and neatly. So pin that into place and then sew the flag section in place. And then take the bottom border and pin that along the bottom of the flag, of the sail, along the bottom of the sail. The flag's at the top, the bottom border's is below the sail. Again, make sure you match up the raw edges so that this right sail section is all in a neat line, and sew that into place, and then it will look like this. So you've joined the flag and the bottom border on. Now you've got one side border left. You used one for the left sail section, this is for the right. Sew this to the right hand side. Make sure you don't sew it to the left because that's where the mast goes. Sew it to the right hand side, but again, refer to the diagrams in the instructions. They're all coloured using the correct print, so then it's easier to look at that and just double check. Even when you've just pinned something, if you're not sure, just have a quick look at the diagram just to make sure it's all in the right place. So once that's pinned in place, sew it together. Press the seam either over to one side. I've pressed mine over to one side, and this completes the right sail section. Assembling the block. So now we're ready to sew the whole block together. So we're going to sew the mast between the left sail and the right sail. So place it between the two and then sew the left hand side of the mast to the right hand side of the left sail, just like this. So I'm going to place these on my board so I can pin them into place, just so there's quite a few seams there and it just helps to keep it nice and even. I think also when you're sewing a thin strip like the mast on, it helps to keep everything nice and still by doing this, particularly those side raw edges. When it's a narrow strip like this, I would put more pins in just to keep it stable when you're sewing. So again, follow the diagram in the instructions so you can see where the mast goes, but as long as you're sewing it between the two sail pieces, it joins them together. So put plenty of pins in and sew the mast into place. and then you can sew the other side of the mast to the right sails section. Again, put plenty of pins in and then sew it together. And that's all the sails with the mast bit section done. You can see I pressed those seams open to keep the mast flat because there's a lot of bulk in those seams. Now we're going to make the boat. You'll know exactly how to do this because you've made 2 boats now with the other 2 blocks. So take the boat section and then the 2 boat corner squares and draw diagonal lines across each of them from one corner to the opposite corner. Place one right sides facing with the boat, so it's in the left hand corner. So make sure the raw edges of the top, bottom and left match up and sew it into place. Make sure that you pin either side of the seam, then you can keep the pins in as you're sewing and it helps it to keep it stable. So just pin far enough away so that your machine foot won't get caught on the pins, and then you can take them out after you've sewn. It just helps when sewing small pieces like this to keep the pins in place. So sew along those drawn lines and then press the seam allowances and trim them as you've done before, and that makes the boat section. And you can now join the boat to the bottom of the sails and mast section. So pin it into place at each end first, and then you can pin between the 2. You can either put this on your mat and push pins in vertically, or you can just do it like this. If you find that you don't think it's looking even, then use your mat. Make sure that seam stays pressed open when you sew it, and then you can sew the C to the bottom. So just put the C right sides facing across the bottom of the boat and pin it together at each end first, and then across and then through the centre. Just rearrange it as you go. Always make sure that the raw edges match exactly. So I always give it a little shake, and it tends to, once I've pinned it, it tends to push them down, and then you can just make sure they're matching and sew the C into place. Then once you've done that, give everything a nice press and your striped sails block is finished.